So welcome, good friends, neighbors, fans of the science of the human past, present or future, hopefully not past. Welcome to the latest installment in our series, What's New in the Fall of the Roman Empire? It's organized by the Initiative for the Science of the Human Past, which, as some of you will know, aims to bring together the sciences and the humanities, humanists and scientists, to deploy the powers of 21st century science with the powers of 21st century history and archaeology, and to discover new data, fundamental new data about our human past. Tonight's talk is taking place with the co-sponsorship of the Department of Classics and with the Standing Committee on Archaeology. Earlier talks have involved Nature Did It by Kyle Harper, genomic insights into bubonic plague. The fall of the Roman Empire is a real fun subject, as you can tell. All of our talks are available, or almost all of our talks are available on our website in video. Gidon Avni gave us a wonderful presentation in the fall about advances in understanding the agrarian revolution that came at the end of late antiquity. And I just want to put in a little plug for an upcoming talk. As you can see, Johannes Krause will be back to talk about the team discovery that I think Linda Reinhardt may have been involved in, and Noreen Turas, in the pathogens involved in the terrible exchange in the New World within the colonial and pre-colonial period. This afternoon, we welcome a wonderful archaeologist whose career is already off to a spectacular start. Kim Bowes is associate professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. After her BA at Williams, she did an MA at the Courtauld Institute in London and her PhD at Princeton, which included a stint here at Harvard, and which produced a stimulating monograph on the archaeology and history of private Christian worship in wealthy late Roman houses and villas, as well as a rapid succession of very impressive appointments at Yale, Fordham, Cornell, the American Academy at Rome, where she was an extraordinary director, as I can testify from eyewitness testimony, and now Penn. Along the way, she produced another book on houses and society in the late Roman Empire, and most importantly for tonight, co-directed a series of excavations distinguished by innovative questions and innovative archaeological techniques, including the archaeosciences so dear to the Initiative for the Science of the Human Past, including paleobotany, about which we'll hear more tonight. And she's done so in Israel, in Albania, in Sicily, think Piazza Armerina, and now in the Roman Peasant Project, in the cradle of Roman economic archaeology, South Etruria. To those of us not from the classical world, you may think of it as Tuscany. And the very zone where John Ward Perkins, operating out of the British School, organized the first great survey archaeology of Roman Italy. The survey archaeology that did so much to produce completely new evidence for the organization of Roman society and economy in the countryside. Professor Bowes will be sharing with us tonight the methods and the results that she and her team devised to take this investigation to a truly new level. So we'll get to go inside archaeology to see where the new data that revise our vision of the Roman economy in the countryside comes from. Archaeology and archaeoscience will again show their power to restore voice to the voiceless, to recover ancient lives from fragile organic and other remains. As she works on the book that will result from the Roman Peasant Project, Professor Bowes is particularly keen to develop her conversation tonight with economists and sociologists, as well as those fans of the ancient and medieval worlds who are here. She's not satisfied to produce new data. She wants to test, discuss, and exploit the new data in dialogue with current economic thinking, which has done so much to transform, thanks notably to the work of Professor Peter Temmen, our understanding of ancient economies, about their nature, their scale, the dynamics and structure of the Roman economy, whence the privilege of so many distinguished colleagues and economists from Harvard, MIT, BU here amongst us. We'll offer you, our audience, and our speaker, a first reaction from two accomplished specialists and non-specialists. Two dear friends and colleagues have graciously agreed to share with us their initial thoughts about Professor Bowes' findings about Roman peasants and their wealth or poverty. In this university, I need hardly introduce the disappearing Orlando Patterson, who is one of the most accomplished sociologists in the world today, John Cowles Professor of Sociology. Professor Patterson's books and essays and articles have changed our, and I can truly say, my own personal understanding of some of the most crucial phenomena of the human condition in history, from slavery to freedom and all along the spectrum. Today, he continues his work on his great project on the history of freedom, but the audience should know that Professor Patterson has contributed mightily to our understanding of slavery in Antiquity and the Middle Ages, and that his interests in Antiquity go back to his student days in the UK, where he had the privilege of knowing Moses Finley. It's no less a pleasure to welcome Leslie Dawsey, Associate Professor of History at Loyola University at Chicago, back to Cambridge. Professor Dawsey did her PhD dissertation in the Department of History. As a graduate student, she used the digital humanities and good old-fashioned biblical scholarship to unearth, identify several hundred Latin texts from Roman Africa that no other historian or archaeologist had ever looked at. Her 2010 book on peasant and empire in Christian North Africa has changed how we see that subject forever. She continues to discover fascinating materials, which she treats always in the most rigorous and intellectually original fashion one can imagine, whether the theme is wife-beating and manliness in late antiquity, a magnificent article, despite its title, in Past and Present, or sleep and sleeping arrangements under the Roman Empire. So we'll begin with a presentation by Professor Bowes and follow with comments by Professor Dawsey and Patterson, and then open the floor for a broader discussion before we continue our conversation, as always, in a nice reception after the talks next door. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining Professor Kim Bowes speaking to us tonight about the archaeology of poverty. How poor were Roman peasants? Did they get poorer?
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike, for that incredibly generous and kind introduction and for the invitation. I want to thank in anticipo Leslie and Orlando for agreeing to comment on this afterwards, and to all of you for coming. I want to share with you, as Mike indicated, the results of a project about Roman rural peasants that myself and some colleagues and I began in 2009 and ran through 2014, and which will be published shortly. And I should say at the beginning, the impetus for this project. The impetus grew out of two books that were published in the early 2000s. Brian Ward Perkins' The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, provocatively titled, and Chris Wickham's enigmatically titled Framing the Middle Ages. We were struck. We were either newly minted PhDs or graduate students when we started this project, and we were really struck in both of these cases by the way in which the end of the Roman Empire was conceived of through a teleology of poverty. So if you were Brian, the end of Rome spelled the impoverishment of everyday people, and if you were Chris, colluded with my husband, Richard Hodges, you saw the end of Rome as ushering in a peasant golden age. We were struck not only by the fact that these two teleologies dramatically disagreed with one another, or that we thought either of them were right or wrong, but because it was patently obvious that both of them departed from a total unknown, the before, the Roman everyday person. What do we know about the average wealth levels of Roman everyday people? Very little. And the idea that one could then characterize and periodize history through their either subsequent enrichment or impoverishment struck us as potentially premature. And I have to say that Mike's book, which came out a little more or less around the same time, was a breath of fresh air because it didn't make any of these errors. So we started this project to try to get some answers, right, to answer this very basic question: how poor were Roman peasants? No. There we go. About the same time that we were formulating these questions, the nature of the study of the Roman economy was about to change dramatically. And for me, anyway, the first moment of that change and the first salvo was this book, provocatively titled The Ancient Economy, simply because it was the same title that Moses Finley gave his own book. And even so, on Amazon today, they're difficult to distinguish unless you're paying attention. The purpose of which was to drive a coach and horses through Finley's notion of a primitive substantivist economy, and above all, Finley's insistence that that kind of economy couldn't be studied with modern economic tools. Much of the work that's been done since, and these are, I'm including here both projects like the Roman Economy Project at Oxford, Scheidel, Morris's, and Soller's monumental Cambridge Economic History of the Greco-Roman World, Peter Temin's Roman Market Economy, Peter Kay's very recent Roman Economic Revolution, and a whole series of other European projects. Much of this new work has taken, not all of it, has taken place under the banner of so-called new institutionalist economics. New institutional economics attempts to extend neoclassical economics to focus on social and legal norms that underlie economic activities. These are norms, are institutions, and in theory represents an integration of socio-historical qualities of markets to neoclassical economics. And following quite carefully the work of Douglas North and his call for a study of past economies through those elements of society, i.e. those structures of society that influence economic performance, much of this work has focused on those matrices of performance. Much of the work that I outline here is new institutional in its outlook. Much of it isn't, or imperfectly understands new institutional work, is only sort of generally informed by an impulse towards quantification, very crudely understood, and a basic understanding of supply and demand economics. Nonetheless, I'm going to use this term, NIE, or New Institutional Economics, to class all of this new work, knowing well that not all of it really qualifies. So what does the Roman economy now look like after 10, 15 years of new institutional approaches to the economy? The first, as I suggested, is that the Roman economy can be studied with modified econometrics, that modern economic modeling can be brought to bear fruitfully on the Roman economy to answer basic questions about its structure and performance. There's a basic assumption that we're dealing with a market economy, and Peter here has dealt with this in specific in a wonderful book on this problem. There tends to be an assumption that the state, either through monetary policy, through demographic interventions, through urbanization, through the annona, is one of the principal engines and determiners of economic performance. And as a consequence, the kinds of subjects that have been studied in most detail in the last 15 years tend to be things like demographics, cities, industry, technology, trade, monetization, market integration, and above all, the vexed question of growth. Did the Roman economy grow or not? And how would we measure that? What's left out of this is represented crudely by this ratio, 80-20. You don't have to agree on the 80-20. It can be 70-30. It can be 60-40. It doesn't matter. The bigger number represents peasants, or I'm going to use the shorthand of peasants for small to medium landowning producers, wage laborers, tenants, rural artisans, combinations thereof. That is to say, the non-slave population of the countryside. We know, and I think we're all on the same page, that we're dealing with an agrarian economy whose principal products are agricultural, whose principal impresarios are these non-elite rural dwellers. The fact that the agricultural strategies of these 80%, their access to markets, their diet, their relationship with estates, their lifeways, all of these issues, therefore, ought to loom very large in our understanding of how the economy performed or didn't. We also now have enormous new data sets, which are extremely exciting, which have largely gone untapped to answer some of these questions. I show you a map from the Roman Rural Settlement Project, a massive big data project in England to gather data on small rural farmers, and that myriad of dots is simply excavated farms. What we actually know about these 80%, however, is still really small. Why it is that the current flurry of extraordinary new work on the Roman economy should have been less interested in the 80% is actually a really interesting historiographic question. If we were here after 1848 and the revolutions of that year, it doesn't matter what any of us did, we would be talking about peasants. And so for everyone from people like Mommsen to Weber to Rostofstev, Roman history was peasant history. And it was the story in multiple variations of the casualty of that peasant to quote-unquote capitalist agriculture. The post-war period, less interested in peasants, and the work that was done on them was of a very particular kind. It was super robust. It drew in social anthropology. The Annales School particularly didn't look at ancient peasants, but looked very carefully at medieval ones. But there was a sense throughout this work that somehow the eternal peasant, characterized by Alexander Chainov in his fundamental work on Russian peasants, represented a type that never changed. Right? That people who lived on the land had certain eternal qualities that allowed comparative work to happen. You could study Roman peasants by looking at 20th century Greek peasants without any real qualms, because ultimately these are people who stand in some way outside of history. Despite the fact that this idea, Chainov's idea of the eternal peasant, had been largely dismissed by people who work on agrarian change, particularly those who work on Central and South America, there nonetheless lingered through the study of Roman peasants this sense somehow of an unchanging Ur universe. And I think there's this combination of the intellectual pedigree, largely Marxist, which saw the beginning of the study of Roman peasants, the continuing sense of people who stood outside of markets and outside of the big historical changes ushered in by the empire, left peasants a little bit in the lurch as far as NIE and as far as new work on the Roman economy. Peasants have therefore, I think because of this, been of less interest. Now, of course, they ought to be of enormous interest to anyone interested in the Roman economy. Statistically, they're inescapable, as both producers and consumers. And questions about their agricultural strategies are just themselves questions about Roman agricultural strategy writ large. One of the most pressing questions of NIE, namely this question of per capita GDP in the Roman Empire or per capita income, is really a question about the well-being or poverty levels of this 80%. And so as a consequence, we started this project, the Roman Peasant Project, an archaeologically based project located in central Italy that, as I said, we ran from 2009 to 2014. And we based it specifically in this Roman heartland, the place where many of the assumptions about Roman economies are born. We had 4 principal aims, 2 of which were very basic and 2 a little more complicated, all of which would derive from a conversation with these historiographies that I just laid out. The first is, can peasants be excavated? There was a school of thought that the remains would be necessarily so fragmentary that they would be unrecoverable. The second was a question that Peter Garnsey raised in the 1970s, where do Roman peasants live? This seemed like a really basic question. It seemed as though we knew the answer to this. We wanted to test this. Then we wanted to move beyond demographics, beyond dots on a map, to thicker descriptions of life of that 80%. We wanted to understand what they ate, what kind of buildings they built for themselves, the way they moved through the land, their agricultural strategies, their social relationships. And finally, this question of wealth or poverty. This is not, I think, the place to discuss the appropriateness of NIE methodologies to the study of, specifically, the study of the peasant economies that I'm interested in, and I've already signaled some blind spots and problems with this. And one of those is the robustness and utility of calculations of GDP and income as part of that NIE project. Instead, what we decided to do was draw very loosely, and I don't want to press this very far, instead on Amartya Sen's idea of capabilities. That is to say, opportunities for well-being that are based on socioeconomic circumstances. Instead of trying to force our data to measure aggregate production, income, capabilities instead assess not only basic human needs like health, resource access, but other deeply embedded social circumstances. Freedom to move, for example, to pursue opportunities, to make social and reciprocal bonds. These are the kinds of questions that fall into a capabilities kind of measurement that's outside GDP, which is one of the reasons that in development economics, there's been a pushback against GDP and a turn to other kinds of ways of thinking about measuring poverty and wealth. Not only did these strike us as potentially more robust tools to think about poverty, but also they might particularly be a good match for the kinds of very local and very contingent data that archaeology produces. So let me set the scene a little bit for you. Our project takes place in southern Tuscany, in the province of Grosseto. It's a liminal area. It's not on a major road. It's not next to the major wine-producing industries of the coast. It's set inland from there, as you can see from this map, I hope. And we began by using a very elegant, multi-pronged landscape survey done as a doctoral thesis by one of my collaborators, Mari Ghisleni, which used aerial survey, a geophysical survey, some excavation, and an intensive site-based sampling survey. She found 500 sites that nobody knew were there before, and a number of what are called off-site scatters. Interestingly, one villa. Right? So this does not look like the kind of landscape that you may imagine a Roman landscape, only a single villa. What was interesting to us is the lower presence of elites allows the presence of non-elites to rise to the surface, and the fact that this is an area of Tuscany, amazingly, where there's very little viticulture. Viticulture destroys archaeology. And so it's very difficult now to do archaeology along the coasts because most of these lands, the site preservation is terrible. Because we're working in an area which is still actually largely grain producing, archaeological site preservation was very good. We had, I want to discuss very briefly, for the archaeologists isn't going to be enough, very briefly our methodology. It was sharply tailored around our research goals. We were interested in bridging the divide between the relatively thin data sets of field survey, which are nonetheless numerous, and the thicker but more confined data sets of archaeology. Why did we want to do this? Because we wanted to get at heterogeneity of peasant experience. Our fundamental assumption was there's no such thing as the Roman peasant, singular, but this was a pluralistic category that would contain people who were richer and were poorer. The only way to get at that would be to dig multiple sites, right? It's the multiple that's embedded in field survey rather than digging a single site, but to do lots of these. We also, simultaneously, wanted to focus on lived experience. That is to say, those kinds of data sets that would bring out lifeways, things that would describe diet, that would describe movement, and these kinds of issues. So we developed a set of techniques in order to do this. We wanted to dig quickly so that we could dig lots of sites, but then we needed to slow down when we hit the material that was interesting to us to really get at those thick descriptions of peasant life. So we used a whole series of techniques to expedite excavation, to produce those diversified data sets, and then we prioritized find collection in stratified levels when we hit them. We were not interested in testing the relationship between surface and subsurface remains. That would have been a different project. That's not what we did. Just quickly on some of those methodologies, we subjected all our sites to magnetometry survey. We then excavated a whole range of scatters that we found from a 10 by 10 to 2 hectares. This was also a way of not prejudging what kind of poverty we were looking at. So we dug big sites, we dug small sites. We used rescue excavation techniques largely borrowed from the UK. We did a lot of work on land units. Now, land units are a kind of analysis that integrates topography, soil types, and hydrology used by the UN to describe land suitability and potential for small farmers. So it's a technique that's developed exactly to study the kinds of people that we were interested in. It's a shorthand and integrated way of getting at what the potential use of land is, not what the actual use of land is. We put a lot of emphasis in environmental data, particularly excavated pollen. And then we didn't do a whole bunch of things that we should have done, which I'm perfectly happy to talk about later. In retrospect, one would have done isotope analysis on some of our faunal material, seasonal C14 analysis. We didn't do it. One of the things we were also trying to do is keep the budget low. We wanted to create a model for a project that was exportable, that other people could do in other places. The results. In 6 years, we excavated 9 sites. 8 sites that had a late Republican, early imperial phase, 4 sites that had additional late antique phases, 1 medieval site to satisfy my husband. Environmental analysis, we did a movement study, we did a big community project to teach children archaeology, and we made lots and lots of mistakes. In fact, I could give you an entire lecture on all the mistakes that we made, many of which were very revealing. So what I'm going to do is march through a series of proxies that I'm going to use to get at this question of how poor were Roman peasants. I'm going to talk about how peasants lived in the land, their agricultural strategies, their mobility, their access to consumer goods and markets, and opportunities for wage labor. Now, the limits of these proxies are many, and I need to get them, I need to talk about those very much up front. And in the beginning. How good these categories are as proxies for capabilities is the first question. The quality and the nature of the data is also really important. I think much of the new NIE work in its laudable insistence to return to quantitative study of ancient economic history has been willing to overlook bad data or fail to take seriously the contingency of this data. It's relative or local rather than absolute or universal quality. The littleness and the contingency of data can actually be a huge boom because it brings home immediately the highly periodized and highly local nature of peasant experience, something that I'm going to emphasize here. We also have to recognize that many of the things that we would like to know, we can't know from archaeology, and at the top of that list is tenurial agreements and ownership. Right? You cannot excavate land ownership, and you cannot excavate the tenurial arrangements that are managing land. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can say, but know from the beginning that this is limited. So the first question, where did Roman peasants live? We spent all these years doing this site. Our first site that we excavated has a big X through the reconstruction. It's the site of San Martino. We assumed that we had excavated a peasant house. Following a 19th century and later historiography that located the site of peasant life in a single space, we assumed that small surface scatters would be peasant houses. As it turns out, only 1 or maybe 2 of the sites that we excavated could be described as such. The site that we erroneously reconstructed as a house actually turned out to be a temporary stable for animals. Another so-called house turned out to be an open-air collective wine and olive press. A village turned out to be a ceramics factory. An off-site turned out to be a field drain. 6 years, 8 sites. Where are the houses? So, What we've developed is a different model for the way in which Roman peasants lived in the central Italian landscape. The challenge, I think, is that in our head is camped some idea of an Anglo-American farm, right? In which you imagine the space of habitation and the space of agricultural production and manipulation and stabling and some kind of artisanal production all within the same unified space. What we found instead was something very different. Instead, what we found is a temporal and functional spectrum of what we've labeled distributed habitation, ranging from occupation over a few years to multiple functions in a single space for many years. That is instead of what we hoped to excavate was different peasant houses with different levels of wealth, instead what we wound up excavating was a range of different kinds of spaces inhabited for different purposes, and as this diagram shows, different periods of time, from a day to part of a season to multiple years. As that distribution was temporal, it was also spatial. Imagine, if you will, your idea, whatever is camped in your head is the idea of the farm, exploded in space, so that the other pieces of a farm's existence are scattered throughout the landscape. Different kinds of functions accommodated in different places. So a stable in one place, a pressing collective in a shared site, a ceramics made in yet a different site. So you have the idea, a completely different idea of what social geography was called to dwell. That dwelling, right, is a distributed kind of a dwelling. The house is exploded in space, and various components of domestic activity are scattered similarly. This was our idea, impressionistically, from the work that we had done. We wanted to put a better qualitative sense of things on the data after we had excavated. And what we did was first thing we did was we agglomerated all the data that we had, every pollen grain, every potsherd, every coin, everything, and analyzed it through correspondence analysis. Correspondence analysis, for those of you who don't know, actually all of you know what it is if you've shopped on Amazon. Correspondence analysis is a multivariable statistical method for detecting patterns in data. It's the method, a version of this is what Amazon uses when you say, if you bought A, perhaps you'd like to buy B, right? It's detecting patterns in purchasing. We're trying to detect patterns in this enormous gross of archaeological data. We wanted to do this to get a more quantitatively robust definition of this distributed habitation. The results are fascinating. As you'll see, our one true house separates out from these production facilities, and which in turn are separated from this clustering of small sporadic sites that are used a few days a year. So when you actually examine the material of these sites, they distinguish themselves statistically material. They have different kind of materiality. When we looked at just the small finds from these sites, and we gave those small finds a functional attribution, using this great bumper catalog called Artifacts, which is an online encyclopedia for small finds, you see further a clear separation of each individual type of site by activity. So this is still correspondence analysis, a different version thereof, in which you can see artisanal production separates out from stock rearing, which separates out from other kinds of activities, based on the actual function of the artifacts that are found in these different sites. So not only were these sites have a different kind of material culture, but the activities that took place in these sites were different, right? They each represent statistically distinct activities. We then looked at our pollen data to try to see what correlation there might be between the kinds of crops that were grown near different kinds of sites. And in some cases, this data is very interesting. So cultivation decisions seem to have also varied along the spectrum of habitation. Sites that had very sporadic end use, very few cereals. The longer you stayed in a place and the more consistently it was used over multi-generations, the more likely it was to show higher quantities of cereal production near the site. There's kind of, with one big piece of alternate data, the inverse relationship between pasture and these sites. So that sites on the sporadic end had lots of pasture around them, whereas sites that were occupied for longer periods of time had less pasture, sort of. That relationship isn't quite so tight. In other words, the actual landscape itself and its management changed depending on how an individual site was being used. Within this distributed habitation, there's a reciprocal relationship with the locale. Once we looked at the land units, which showed a remarkably diverse landscape in terms of land suitability, what you could potentially do with the land. Each of these different colors represents different levels of suitability, with green being the highest and red being the lowest for cereal agriculture. And you can see from this mosaic that even within a tiny area, there's enormous amounts of variability. This is true of the Mediterranean in general. It's absolutely true of central Tuscany. And we've known about this for a long time. Because we've known that Roman, certainly Roman, large Roman landowners, and now as it turns out also Roman peasants, would diversify their holdings, right, so that they had pieces of land in different ecological pockets. What we found examining our distributed habitation pattern against our land unit data is we could see peasants taking maximum advantage of this Mediterranean microvariability. What we particularly saw was the constant construction, almost a fetishistic obsession with field drains. We found field drains everywhere. They drained every piece of land they could possibly drain. They drained pasture. They drained cereal land. They drained everything. In other words, what we see through the consideration of all these data sets together is a kind of extraordinary curation and micromanagement of the land. Now, what's interesting is that they didn't always make the use of the land that you would predict through this kind of land units modeling, right? So we would have sites that were smack in the middle of what ought to be great cereal land. It's entirely used for pasture, right, when we look at our pollen data. In other words, there's an element, a strong element of human agency. The landscape is not determining how people use it, right? There's a reciprocal relationship between decision making and multiple possible options. So in the end, to the question of where did Roman peasants live in the late Republic, they lived in this distributed network of specialized sites, testifying, I think, to an extraordinarily intensive moment of the curation and intervention in the landscape. All of this data focuses on a very tight chronology. It's maximum late 2nd century BC, and it is over by the Flavian period. I'll get back to this question in a second. So what are the implications of this? First of all, demographics. There has been a big attempt on the part of archaeologists who use, or especially historians who use Italian field survey data to try to extract demographic data from those numbers. How many people live in the landscape? Count the dots from field survey. There have been a whole series of attempts to do this. The assumption is that these small sites, represented by small dots, equal people. What we showed is that they don't represent different people. They represent the same people moving around. Ergo, the calculations of demographic calculations based on field survey data may be exaggerated between 13 and 36%, depending on which method you're using and which dots you're counting as small or large, etc. So when this data has been used to argue for big Malthusian pressures on central Italian peasants, those claims may also be exaggerated. And I think these findings have an important contribution to the question of how many people lived in the countryside and how many people lived in the city. I think less people lived in the countryside than we thought. And I think that urban-rural ratio, that 80-20 that I cited at the beginning, may be in need of readjustment. Other more interesting questions. This distributed habitation implies lots of movement between individual sites, right? You have a stabling place in one point. You have a collective press in another. You go somewhere else to make or buy your ceramics. You're constantly moving around your landscape. It suggests that family labor inside the peasant family is distributed as well. when I first was working on this data and I took it to Cambridge and I showed it to some of my colleagues there, Robin Osborne looked at the field drain. He said, you know, your field drain, I look at your field drain and I think child labor. What he really was talking about was the labor surplus that's implied by this construction of large and small buildings everywhere throughout the landscape, right? And the ability to manage all of these sites in a concerted fashion. We might be able to hypothesize something about this question of whether we have free wage laborers or slaves. A highly mobile landscape like this, which involves people moving around and doing specialized activities in special places, they could be slaves. I think the chances are not. I'll talk about wage labor in a minute. I would say, too, it probably tends to look more like people who own their own land rather than tenants, but again, I don't want to press that either. What are the limits of this phenomenon, right? We already know that this phenomenon doesn't exist in many of the Roman provinces, okay? It absolutely doesn't exist in Britain, and it absolutely doesn't exist in France. The data there is so much better than there is in Italy. Farms and peasant small holdings largely look like this reconstruction. They're surrounded by ditches. They're in unified spaces. They look much more like what we imagine a farm to look like. This intensification, on the other hand, we've started to find in multiple places. They found it in the Pontine Valley. I think they found it in the Tiber Valley. This moment of massive, intensive use of the land at exactly this point, the 2nd century BC, the 1st century AD. Other provinces have dramatically different chronologies, as I'm sure Leslie will talk about, who works on North Africa. In other words, there's no unitary peasant experience. It's not that there's not only a single kind of peasant, but the way in which, and the mode in which peasants dwelled in the landscape in central Italy would be dramatically different from their cousins in Gaul. Another important result is that we think we have the first, some of the first evidence for crop rotation. That is to say, the rotation probably of cereals with leguminous crops with a period of pasture. It's called tripartite crop rotation or convertible agriculture. We get this from comparing our pollen percentages for legumes, cereals, and pasture. If we had one data point that looked like this, it would mean nothing. What's interesting is that all the sites that have notable cereal production also have almost slightly less, but almost the same quantities of leguminous or fodder crops, right? These are nitrogen fixing plants that help return nutrients to the soil. There was a pessimistic view of Roman agriculture that said that nobody knew anything about this. Our archaeobotanists find this hilarious, since crop rotation is already documented in the Bronze Age. In any case, we think it's pretty likely that we have it here. We cannot know, however, whether they're rotating crops in the same field or rotating crops in adjacent fields in a kind of cyclical pattern. These are two different modes of crop rotation. Our data is nowhere near fine-grained enough to be able to tell us this. The implications are interesting. Of course, the agricultural revolution in Europe, once rotation began, saw a massive increase in yields. This is probably not true for us. Mediterranean agriculture is not as responsive to rotation strategies. Maybe you're looking at a 20% increase in yield, but maybe not. Instead, what you're looking at, if you're a smallholder, you can use all of your land most of the time, instead of having to allow it, requiring it to be fallow every other year, right? So that's an enormous overall increase in production for the whole system. You're producing vegetable proteins for human and animals, right? Legumes and or fodder are good protein sources. And it deeply implicates animals, right? Fodder is our biggest leguminous production. They're growing lots of fodder, and they're probably including pasture in their rotation. Animals really matter in this system. It's not an animal-less system. And other places are starting to find the same data. I just show you some maps from northern Gaul where, using macro remain data, not pollen data, they found the second that they start to grow naked wheats in northern Gaul, they start to introduce legumes. And the second they stop in the 2nd century AD, the legumes dramatically decrease. Right? They understand that growing naked wheats is a greedy process and you need to replenish the soil. So it's not just Central Italian smallholders that are doing this. It seems to be happening in lots of different places. Another interesting result is the data that we have from mobility. So the fact that we have these multiple specialized sites in the landscape already points to a mobile population moving around. We then also, our geoarchaeologist thought I was completely mad when I asked her to do this, we mapped the nearest geological outcrop for all of our building stones to figure out where they came from. This little granary, which was part of the one of the true/house farms that we found, was composed of 5 separate different kinds of building stones that came as far away as 12 kilometers away. So what in the world is going on here? They're not obviously walking 12 kilometers to pick up 3 stones. What's probably happening is that they're recycling older buildings in the landscape and bringing them piecemeal to their new building site. They're doing this while they're already moving around for other reasons. They're visiting grandma, they're going off to their pressing site, they're with their sheep. This is a stone-poor landscape. You have to work to get stone. And this seems to be one of the ways in which they do it. Therefore, those stones are really good proxy data for people on the move. The ceramic data we're just finishing working on, what we found is a kind of extraordinary homogeneity between these small peasant sites in terms of the classes of wares and the number of different classes of wares versus those in wealthy homes. Peasants are not eating off 1 plate and 1 cup, right? They're eating off 10 different kinds of plates and 12 different kinds of cups. Even the smallest, crappiest sites have lots of fineware. Much of this is imported. The quantities are much lower, and interestingly, the aesthetic qualities are much lower. They're poorly stamped, they're overfired, they're like seconds, right? So this points largely to a kind of IKEA culture in which everyone shares the same kinds of dining and cooking, et cetera, kind of wares. And the differences are very subtle. All of the sites that we had on the more permanent end of the spectrum produced coins. I think putting pay definitively to Michael Crawford's idea that poor rural people don't use money. They clearly used money. They're low-value coins, however. You're not going to pay your taxes with these. You're probably not even going to buy a horse with these. And the quantities were quite low. So I think we have a combination of coined exchange together with barter and reciprocal exchange. And finally, one of the most interesting things we found, we thought we were going to go dig a peasant village, right? This had been categorized as a village in the field survey. We went off to excavate it. It's a ceramics factory. Right? Even the geophysics managed to miss that this thing was a ceramics factory. It's a planned ceramics factory. It has 2 phases of use. We were deeply disappointed to find this because, as I pointed out to our group, we're the Roman peasant project, not the Roman pottery project. Excavating ceramics factory is a big pain in the neck. However, what it allowed us to do is actually track the things that were made there and find out where they were purchased in the countryside. So this map of these least cost paths and the green dots at the end mark places where people bought the ceramics from this ceramics factory, right? We did thin section analysis on them and we're actually able to show how one got from point A of production to point B of consumption. Now, it is always assumed that these kinds of fine wares, right, which are the apogee of Roman ceramic production, are shipped off to cities. No one has ever really considered seriously rural demand, which in aggregate is enormous, right? 80% of the population buying pots. It's a lot of pots. And indeed, that's exactly what they're doing. It also represented a potential place for wage labor. Ceramics is a seasonal business. You can't make ceramics in the winter, right? You have to make them in the summer when it's hot. It involves huge quantities of people doing everything from mining clay to cutting wood and bringing wood, transporting pots, et cetera, et cetera. And it happens in these big bursts. So almost certainly a place you could get a job, right? Just as Walmart represents wage labor for modern farmers, this is Walmart. So if we go back to our matrices and ask this question again, how poor were Roman peasants? We may have lower population pressure than we assumed. We have knowledge networks in the form of this understanding of convertible agriculture, lots of mobility, an abundant consumer culture, access to markets, and potentially multiple income options. Do these amount to a kind of checklist of potential capabilities? I would say yes. Now, quickly, because those of you here care about late antiquity, which I used to really care about too, but got very distracted by the late Republic. what happens in late antiquity? So the situation that I described before, again, I emphasize 2nd century BC, 1st century AD, after which something changes. And the crudest measure of what changes is, of course, from the field survey. We go from 260 sites to 5, and then a slight uptick to 8 in the early 5th century AD. Only the larger sites persist past the 1st century AD. Now, this pattern of a massive decline in either the late 1st or early 2nd century AD is typical of central Italy. Ours is not the only survey that's found this. It's much debated. It's often laid at the door of rising provincial fortunes, North Africa, that beats out Italian farmers, and or the transition to a massive tenancy-based agriculture engaged in pastoral agriculture. What's clear now, of course, is that that carpet of sites, right, really represented distributed habitation, right? And the disappearance of the dots actually represents the cessation of a mode of dwelling, right? The end of distributed habitation. We no longer find any functional separation by sites. So this was our map for the late Republic, the way in which activities were separated into different sites. Here's late antiquity. Single site, all functions, right? Artisanal, agricultural manipulation, stabling, et cetera, all taking place in the single site. So that distributed pattern, which also produced that pattern of dots on the maps, is over. The best example of this is the site we excavated, the first site we excavated in our project, called Piavina. It's a 4x4 house with a post-built extension for animals. It has stables, it has hearths, it has some artisanal activity, it has all kinds of domestic signatures taking place in a single site. Now, in Italian late antique archaeology, when you find a site like Piavina, the tendency is to call it a continuity, right? It represents some kind of continuity with earlier Roman settlement. When in fact, I think what we found is that the mode of living that these sites represent is starkly different, right? And that's what the correspondence analysis show us, that the nature of activities, what it means to dwell in the landscape, has changed. And it's a big change. Along with the end of distributed habitation means an end of the specialized sites, an end of the cultivation specialization around those sites, and that moment of intensive curation and intervention in the landscape. All of those signatures are gone. However, pollen data indicates that there's no cessation of rotation practices. Those same ratios attend to late antique sites as they did to earlier sites. And there's no massive change in overall percentages of pasture, cereal, et cetera. So like the Fields of Britannia project, which is another extraordinary big data project studying the late Roman landscape of Britain, despite the fact that we have a massive change in human demographics, it doesn't seem to bring about a concomitant massive change in the agrarian landscape. It's managed differently, but similar species ratios. Now, the mobility proxies also changed dramatically. All of our late antique sites are built with one kind of building stone from close by, right? This whole thing of gathering different stones as you're moving around the landscape, done. Given that mobility was at least partially a product of distributed habitation, that ends, as does this signature for mobility. Now, interestingly, despite all of these markers, and despite the cessation in mobility, we still find strong access to consumer goods. So that the site of Piavina produced tons of stuff, right? And in fact, when you study the ceramics, which we have actually done for here, and you map out all the different functional categories, they are identical to a wealthy home at the nearest city, Roselle. There are more of them in the wealthy house. They have greater quantities of stuff, but they have the same stuff, right? The same functional classes of ceramics. 50 coins from this tiny, crappy little house, which is quite remarkable. In other words, both those systems of monetary exchange and access to consumer goods seem to remain robust. So if we go back and look at our measurements for capabilities in late antiquity, we have no population pressure that we can find. In fact, very hard time finding the people at all. Convertible agriculture seems to continue. We seem to have access to markets and a consumer culture. However, there are other markers that change, particularly these markers for mobility. And that's the one I think that gives me pause, to no longer be able to see people moving around the landscape in the same way, but to find them either in their choices of building stones and in other ways more parked in a single place. I have put capabilities fewer here. I think the jury's still out on this. It is a dramatically different world, right? We can't talk about it in the same way. What it meant to live in this landscape as a peasant had dramatically changed. So to conclude, as I've emphasized, that moment that I've hypothetically pointed to, increased capabilities, is very short-lived, right? It's a late Republican flash in the pan. The late antique moment where we may see a shrinkage in those same capabilities is also short-lived, right? These are really short periods of time. The data that we're looking at is contingent and highly local. The phenomena that I'm describing do not necessarily apply even in other parts of Italy, and certainly not in other parts of the empire. What it points to, though, right, are a far more volatile situation for peasants than I think we had ever imagined. Boom-bust cycles in which what one generation's experience might be dramatically different 2 generations on. The whys for these boom-bust cycles, I still have no answers for this. I think we cannot discount the role of the state. These are part of larger patterns of economic boom-bust cycles that are not just exclusive to these regions or these people. And certainly the way in which this so-called global economy is integrated or not will also play an enormous role in the fate of these small rural dwellers. In other words, this is very different from a unified peasant experience, which I think doesn't exist. I think to also point to the fact that 80% of the people lived in cycles of enormous change certainly also points yet again away from an ahistorical, unchanging peasant. It also calls into question to what extent we can even talk about a unified experience and economy of 80% of the population, or 60, or whatever number you like. It's that variation, I think, that we have to take seriously to heart when we really start talking about the unified status of the Roman economy and the empire generally. Thank you.
Kim, that was amazing. Wow. We now will hear from a first reaction from Leslie Dawson.
Do you want me to take this down?
Followed by Orlando Patterson. Where do you want to?
Do you want to sit here?
Yeah.
I'll leave that up.
Hi, is this working?
Yes.
Okay, great. That was fantastic, Kim. It was rich and very original. And one thing I wanted to just thank you for is working on this sort of site. I mean, these are often very unprepossessing sites. They're not going to be turned into an archaeological tourist attraction. But as you say, these are essential for understanding the 80% or 70% or 60% of the people who lived in the countryside. I especially wanted to commend the attention to pollen data, which I thought was a very important part of your work, as I will talk about soon. So I have framed my comments in reverse chronological order, probably because I'm a late Roman historian. So first, what is significant here for the late Roman period? And secondly, what is their significance for the early imperial to 2nd century transition? Okay, so first for this late Roman period, one of the most interesting aspects of this talk, in my opinion, is what it tells us about a continuity in rural consumption as well as rural production in the late Roman period. So in contrast to a catastrophic fall in levels of material consumption portrayed by authors such as Brian Ward Perkins, who you referred to, what you show, at least for the sites that remain in occupation, is not a decline, but a continued ability of the population to access consumer products, whether these are in the form of coins, pottery, including amphora, or stones. And indeed, I would see the reduction of geological sources of stone to one main quarry as possibly evidence that the stone had become a locally sourced commodity rather than a more haphazard attempt to get scrap stone from wherever you could find it in the earlier period. And this accords with other work that suggests an improvement in rural standard of living in this period, in the 5th century. And I'm referring here to work on skeletal evidence, which Michael McCormick knows very well, early work by Nicola Kopka and Irene Barbiera showing the increase of people's height and a decrease of indicators of stress, such as orbital lesions or enamel hypoplasia, starting in the 5th century. This has been interpreted a rise in the standard of living among the general population. And there's also been recent studies suggesting a continuity in rural production in the 5th century. And I'm thinking here of a recent article by Paolo Squatriti on the environmental history of Ostrogothic Italy, where he argues for the continued development of local economies in the 5th and 6th centuries at a time when demographic pressures ease, sometimes with new products such as chestnut trees, sometimes with old products such as animal husbandry, more relevant to this study. But he sees in no way a reversion to uncultivated landscapes of forest and waste. One thing that came out in the end of your presentation was the word autarky, whether this was autarky in the late Roman period, by which I think you meant, is this a more localized economy where people produce most of what they consume locally? And I would say that your pollen and pottery data suggest that it is not. I was very impressed by the continuity of your pollen data. Virtually the same levels in the 1st century as in the 5th. And if anything, there's less arboreal pollen in the 5th century, about the same levels of pastoralism and cereal and legume production as before. So this suggests that this is a landscape where intensive animal husbandry combined with mixed farming continues from the late Republic to the 5th century, almost certainly as part of a market economy, not self-sufficient, not self-sufficiency. And this brings me to my second point, the question of what on earth happened in the 2nd century to explain the dramatic drop in the number of sites between the late Republic and early 1st century CE and the 2nd to 5th centuries. Now, one thing perhaps we can talk about in discussion is whether this dramatic drop in numbers of sites from 200 to, what was it? 5 is due to a decrease in datable pottery, for instance, which I've argued elsewhere happens in North Africa, and not real. It's not a real reduction in numbers of sites. But you seem to think it is because of a shift in the distributed nature of sites. So what does this mean? Well, traditionally, scholars have often seen this as evidence of demographic decline, possibly partly due to the 2nd century Antonine plague, which continued on into the 3rd and early 4th century. Although there's new work, including some by Professor McCormick, suggesting that other things like climate change may have also had a role. Other scholars, and here I'm thinking of especially the work of Alessandro Lonaro in his book Peasants and Slaves, see this drop in sites as a shift in elite investment to more extensive agriculture, i.e. pastoralism. However, your pollen data shows that this area was already based on a managed, intensive sort of pastoralism with mixed farming, even during the late Republic and early Empire settlement peak. The type of agriculture doesn't change very much, but the distribution of sites does a lot. And this makes me wonder whether your team has found a trend toward agglomeration or larger farm sites, which gets to the question of where did the peasants live. It is very interesting that your sites from the 2nd century on include all functions, residential use as well as production use, even though they're not villas. This strikes me as possibly a shift towards a sharecropping system, we usually call it colony during the Roman period, where landlords are setting up the farmstead occupied by the farm workers, as opposed to a more smallholder model before of small, perhaps free farmers. And I'm really following Lenaro's work here, who has argued that this is what you're seeing, not just here, but elsewhere in Italy in this shift from the 1st to 2nd centuries. I think that's possible, and I actually would be interested in linking it to something that seems way far off field, which is a decline in military service in Italy between the 1st and 2nd century CE. In the 1st century CE, there were still a lot of peasants who were serving in the Roman army. By the 2nd century, that had almost stopped completely. These people often got set up as small farmers in Italy. Now, that's no longer the case. What you are getting, though, is aristocratic investment in land, especially for meat production and wool production, pastoralism. And I wonder whether that's what you're seeing here. But what's interesting to me, and this goes back to the first point about late antiquity, that these farmers, even if they are becoming, instead of free farmers, they're becoming, instead of farm workers on someone else's land, more controlled, therefore, their movement more confined, but they still have access to goods on the market, and never more so than in the 5th century CE.
Excellent, thank you.
I think he's coming to change that around. Thanks, thank you. So, as often the case, I'm the interloper here. I like interloping, and it can be very productive, not only for pirates, but for academics. And as those of you who know my work on slavery and social death, which is an extended exercise in interloping. I'm an archaeologist, obviously, and not a specialist in Roman history, although I've spent a lot of time studying it. But I come as a sociologist who's also spent a lot of time working on peasants. In fact, I grew up amidst peasants. My grandfather's a peasant, and Jamaica, where I grew up, is still a larger society supported by peasants. And but I'm also a sociologist who believes in categories, and the peasant, of course, is one that for a long time is an object of considerable interest, no more among anthropologists than sociologists, but I remain fascinated with it. So I was totally absorbed with this work. I went over the PowerPoint several times and then sort of dug into whatever work I could find of Professor Bowes. This is wonderful work. This is sociology, and I can't say how not just fascinated I am, but with the implications of the work, I think are just stunning, especially in light of what has gone before. The archaeological neglect of the 80% is just amazing. It's hard to believe that this is the first systematic archaeological study of these people. It just blew my mind. What have people been doing? Is the edifice complex so strong that if you can't find a mansion or a villa or a town, so you're not going to do it? I was just flabbergasted that this is the first major systematic study of what Eric Wolf, of course, will call it the people without history. Now, Professor Bowes began with not a critique, but an indication that the dominant approach is that of the macroeconomic, macro-sociological work of originally Hopkins, Garnsey, and of course, more recently, the dominant voice in this area, Walter Scheidel. I think it's very relevant. It has significant implications for the Hopkins-Garnsey thesis. But I want to push back a little with respect to Walter Scheidel's work, and not just because he likes my work, but Walter has been very emphatic in the fact that GDP findings do not indicate one way or the other what's going on in the mass of people. I have a quote here from that: economic trends need not have matched trends in human welfare, and that real income of workers could fall as GDP grew. And human bodies could shrink as the economy expanded, and therefore there's no indication of what's happening on the ground with the ordinary people. And what Professor Bowes has done, in fact, is to show that indeed is the case. But as a sociologist, however, my first response, we're a generalizing science, which may be our problem, are these peasants? This is not presented as agricultural laborers, which is the broader term, but peasants, and that's what's immediately sort of caught my eye, which I was intrigued with. And it's important to me whether they're peasants or not, or other kinds of workers. There are many kinds of labor arrangements in Rome, of course: small-scale landowners, tenants, sharecroppers, rural wage laborers, and of course the group which I've spent too much time studying, slaves. And the ongoing debate in Roman world about how significant they were. The tenants themselves were of many types. So depends on what we mean then by peasant. And the shine of sort of tradition is now long past. In fact, there's really great work being done by people like Shannon and Wolf and so on, who have persuaded a lot of us, myself included, that there is such a thing as a peasant type, that it does constitute a meaningful category in the way in which serfs are a meaningful category, although they're much heterogeneity, and the way in which slaves, and of course slavery and social death, was an attempt, in fact, to define what it is that's special about slaves as a category, in spite of variation, tremendous variation in that category between those of the elite slaves of the Ottoman down to simple plantation workers in the South. So what the literature suggests and what my own observations in rural Jamaica suggest is that there are distinctive categories. Shannon was one of my favorite authors on this, which he calls the awkward class. Sort of peasant, small agricultural producer who, with the help of the simple equipment and the labor of their families, produce mostly for their own consumption, direct or indirect, for the fulfillment of obligations to holders of political and economic power. The fact that they're part of a larger socioeconomic order, the provision of cities and markets is always been seen as critical. The idea that peasants are isolated is never sort of been seen to be characteristic of this group. Household-based production, little specialization, they're strongly linked to economically and culturally to a village system. Eric Wolf, perhaps the most eminent author of this thing, suggests that there are three kinds of funds which peasants all over the world they engage in. Replacement fund, this is to feed themselves and their family. A rent fund, which is what they have to hand over to the powerful. And ceremonial funds, which are the sort of the funds which are necessary to do all the things for the community, the ceremonies and so on. This has been found to be quite very much the case where in Latin America, the Caribbean, India, or what have you. So I'm convinced, let me say, that there is such a group. This is a distinct type. And they're not homogeneous, but they all have this characteristic. And while there may be some fluidity, they move in and out of different kinds of labor arrangements. This does constitute a distinct category. So how do the folks excavated by Professor Bowes measure up here? The earlier group, with all the fascinating details of the distributed nature of production and so on, it does indeed fit the category of classic peasant group, a fairly prosperous one at that, and with an unusual level of specialization. And the work here is just amazing. And it's consistent with the beneficial nature of the climate of that period, the warming, the rainfall, and so on. And but it clearly undercuts the one traditional thesis. It seems to me that this really is the final nail in the coffin of the Hopkins, Keith Hopkins, and Peter Garnsey conquest view of what's happening. And for those of you who don't know the story, the idea that there was in the late Roman Republic, the imperial conquest and the rise of large villas and the inflow of a large amount of goods from the empire, and with the disruption of peasant life as people move out to join the army, as well as with the growth of the large latifundia, that this was the death knell of the peasantry. That's the standard view. And Peter Garnsey just published not so long ago a summary view which restated this. I think Professor Bowes' work shows that this is just not the case, and we can sort of R.I.P. to that. Keith Hopkins is a former colleague of mine, and whom I greatly respect. But clearly we have to rethink this view of the peasantry. This is a prosperous, fascinating group who are doing all kind of innovative things, which is just not consistent with the conquest theory. On the other hand, the later group just don't strike me as peasants at all. I mean, what we find there is, I wouldn't call them peasants. The data seems more, well, the data is sort of consistent with several interpretations, but it seems consistent with them being laborers, impoverished tenants, and even slaves. And I'd love to, I mean, I kept, obviously, in fact, I had to make an attempt not to see them as slaves, because of my own biases, but the absence of home sites is telling. The fact that that one finds all these artifacts and these possessions from indicating involvement with the market economy is not surprising. If you visit the most impoverished peasant home in rural Jamaica, you'll find all sort of things. In fact, they seem to make a fetish of foreign things, but they're part of the broader economy, and certainly it indicates that there's in fact, the connection, the international connection, the international market is still there, and as peasants, the people are in fact involved with this broader system. To that extent, then, it's consistent with the idea of the peasant being involved with broader activity, but it's also consistent with the fact that they may be wage laborers, but it seems to me that the evidence here, unlike what I said earlier, this looks like an economy, a group in substantial decline. And more consistent, and I'd like to, I've just finished reading not long ago, only a month or so ago, Kyle Harper's recent study, and so perhaps too enamored with it. But it certainly sort of dovetails with what would seem to be a remarkable decline. Where do they live? It's also found that interesting. The urban issue in Roman history has been a fascinating one. It seems that this supports Erdkamp's view that the urban is impossible to define in a clearly economic sense in Roman history. That the town-country divide does not dovetail with the agricultural, non-agricultural divide. That a great part of towns, not the large villages, but a large number of towns are engaged in the agricultural sector. That, on the other hand, many people in the countryside were not involved with agriculture. And that many peasants may have engaged in day labor during the slack period. Again, this reminds me so much of peasantry in the Caribbean, where they're very much involved with their owner-occupied farms. But during the slack period, they work on the plantations to get cash, basically, which all peasants need. But it seems clearly there's a shift to, or one interpretation, it seems to me, trying to make sense of that fascinating data on which you present, is that, is this consistent with the view that there's a shift to the small towns by the former peasants in late antiquity for better part-time employment, and that they also seem to, this is consistent with, as it's pointed out, Peter suggested, greater control by landowners. I just sort of running through different possible interpretation of that data. You know, the great thing about this work, it reminds me of what's often said of the great ethnographer Bronislaw Malinowski, that his data was so rich that his own interpretation can be put aside, and one can interpret it in many different ways, often opposite of his own. I'm not suggesting we're doing that here, but it seems to me that what we have here is greater control and of this group. The squatting in villas. What's that about? So people are moving then into the urban areas under the control of the greater lords, and perhaps losing their independence, or perhaps sort of engaging more in agriculture. And in fact, what we see is they're basically wage laborers, perhaps, or maybe even slaves working in these sites. Professor Bowes' remarks on population are also so extremely fertile. She found in general that Malthusian pressures were less than assumed. This goes against the grain of much that's being written now, not only by Harper and Schuyler, but by others. She finds zero population pressure and little mobility. It is a little surprising. In the sense that what I thought, as an interloper who sort of avidly consumes everything produced by the specialists, the consensus seemed to be that Malthusian pressure is important throughout Roman history, though it worked in different directions. The plagues, of course, sort of reduced population substantially, but then increase as a result earnings in the following group, which then leads to an increase in pressure on the land, and so on. That combined with the pandemics have persuaded me that, in fact, these are, and of course, Kylie's sort of synthesis, that this is critical. Does this data, Professor Bowes, does your data perhaps begin to question what I thought was an emerging consensus on this? I mean, I'd love to know. And clearly it depends on Pierre's study. I'm curious to, but as I hinted already, how this fits with Harper's study of climate change and infectious diseases. And so I was a little startled to see that you claim no evidence of climate change in the second period. That came as a shock after being totally persuaded that it's important, having just finished Kyle's work. This was about the same time as the beginning of what he calls the Little Ice Age. Could climate change accounted for some shift from the distributed specialized agriculture of the earlier period, perhaps? Was this shift to towns and villages a response to cooling, cheaper, more efficient use of heating? And so there are many ways one could speculate on that. Any evidence of the bubonic plague of 541, or was this too late for your excavations? I'm not quite sure when you completed yours. But again, I was very, having been so enthusiastic about the Harper study, was quite taken aback by, I won't say the cold water poured on on this thesis, and I would certainly love to hear more about this. I want to be reflated because you did deflate quite significantly what I thought was an emerging consensus. But to conclude, this is just one of the most informative and innovative works I've read for a long time, and it's sort of it's going to change a lot of what we as historical sociologists think about the Roman world. But it's moving in a direction, which, as I said earlier, is just feast to the sociological mind. So thank you very much. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Turn the camera off.
Okay, great. Okay. I'll just offer a couple comments if I can. You all have been incredibly patient and haven't got to ask any questions of your own, so I'll offer a few comments on both Leslie and Orlando's comments briefly and then turn it all over to you. So, Leslie, the question of whether, how seriously on the one hand to take robust consumption and on the other to take measurements about changing mobility and other kinds of patterns, I think is a really important question. It goes to the heart of how crude our measurements are for what we're calling wealth and poverty. And the fact that we had so little comparative data to put next to a site like Piavina in its last phase hampers us. Now, why I am really intrigued by the idea of colony or sharecropping tenants as representing one of these shifts. This is a really interesting idea, not least because it also accounts for different modes of actually dwelling in the landscape, right? Not simply different modes, just different tenurial systems, but that have actual impact on the way people live out their day-to-day life, which is an interesting and fascinating idea. I've been really reluctant to go there. There's been so much work that has attempted to read tenurial relationships out of archaeology, which has struck me as mostly wrong. And so I've been very reluctant to go there myself. I'd like to be persuaded that this is possible, and I think, Orlando, you made a similar comment. And I need to go off and think about this. Now, the thing we have to remember about these sites is that the change that happens doesn't happen in the 5th century. It happens in the 1st. Right? So whatever it is that we see happening is already happened by the end of the Flavian period before the beginning of the 2nd century AD. Really early. And in fact, I gave a talk at Princeton not too long ago, and I said late antiquity began in the Flavian period, and I thought Brent Shaw was going to cry. He was so angry by this concept, right? The idea that we could see these changes this early. And if you work on North Africa, it just seems bizarre, right? That you would see the kinds of patterns that we associate with 6th century, right? Already in the 2nd. And the reasons for these, as I've said, in Italy, right, have focused either on Lonaro's ideas or Carandini's. And for the moment, I haven't really wanted, I guess, to get into the whys, because I don't understand why. And the causal mechanisms that we have at our disposal don't fit the chronologies, right? And the other thing that we ought to be honest about is about cities, which is that the flash in the pan that is Italian urbanism ends at the same time, and that many of our cities enter a major phase of decline at this period or even earlier. And so that carpet of cities that you saw on the slide that I showed, which is from the the Oxford project, which represents, a kind of amazing mosaic of cities. When you have archaeology for those cities, they don't look like, in the 2nd century, they don't look like what they used to look like, right? They've massively shrunk. They have no political center anymore. They are largely bath complexes and other entertainment structures, as John Patterson's called them, so that you actually have a concert between the two movements. They're not divorced, as you describe. And thank you for drawing my attention again to Erdkamp's work, which is so very interesting on this urban-rural question. I will now, Orlando, if I could just respond quickly to your questions about climate change and demography. I am pushing it back against the high counters. Now, the high counters are not only based in archaeology. So there's a group of people who've used archaeology and a group of people who've used these complicated and problematic Augustan census data. And I'm not going to rehearse those arguments. Certainly from an archaeological perspective, it's not to say that this moment doesn't mark a potential high mark of population. The question is it as high as we thought it was? And certainly the archaeological data that we've produced would suggest no. Climate change, so no. Right? We have no evidence for climate change whatsoever. All of the massive changes that are happening are human-driven, right? They're human. They're social changes. They're not driven by climate. Now, certainly for your little ice age, we're too early, right? all our sites are abandoned before that. And that's important to point out, right? That these boom-bust economies that we see throughout the empire do not leave a kind of flourishing, superpopulated world everywhere by the time you get to the mid-6th century, right? Italy's looked like 1970s Pittsburgh for a really long time, right? By the time, sorry, I can say this, I live in Pennsylvania. So that comparing, say, the superpopulated world of Asia Minor, right, in this period, or say Gaza, with the bombed out landscapes of central Italy is apples and oranges. And so when we consider questions about the degree to which plague impacted highly dense populations, we can't imagine them impacting equally. And Kyle's very good about recognizing this. I think, though, the more that we dig into this data and we're willing to recognize these chronological distinctions, the harder it is to talk about these general patterns because you have such a disunified, dramatically different empire that you're dealing with. And so I think that's where I really push back against this. It's not to deny that these ideas don't hold true in certain times and places, but they are certainly not universal. And so when we want to actually imagine the way in which climate change or pandemics affect different populations, then we have to pay very close attention to that variability.
Thank you, Orlando. Thank you, Leslie, for your comments. Obviously, this is a very rich conversation. Obviously, there's a reception waiting for us. Obviously, you have a lot of questions and thoughts. Perhaps we could get a couple of questions from the audience to kind of rev us up before we go out and continue the conversation together over drinks and some light repast. Dr. Nick Patterson.
I want to make an amateur suggestion. One suspects that in the late Republic, early Empire, thank you. One suspects that in the late Republic, early Empire, there was a great concentration of capital with huge wealth of the Roman elites. And if that's the case, the surplus capital had to go somewhere. And it very well may have gone into land purchase, which would perhaps explain Orlando's comment about why we're seeing this shift in what he thinks is likely to be ownership. I just wanted to comment that if there's a shift in ownership to some like serf system or something like that, you may not be able to observe the Malthusian pressures. The owners are only going to want the people they need on the land to work the land. So the fact that you don't see any kind of population increase, they're being pushed off elsewhere maybe into city slums or something. I mean, you're only going to have the people there who are needed to do the work. Amateur's comment, thank you.
The first part of what you said, I'm fascinated by, and I become increasingly interested in what some have termed the booty economy, right? That this coincides with the moment of the booty economy, right? The massive importation of
goes to Asia, while the wealthiest
exactly, which itself is a flash in the pan. It doesn't have a kind of long, sustainable sort of afterlife. And I think as people like Peter Bang and other people have thought really carefully about the way in which the booty economy has these disruptive but potentially fecund impacts on this period. So that's a very interesting idea.
Thanks so much. This was really fascinating. You started with Brian Ward Perkins, who has an idea of a homogeneous and interconnected Rome that becomes heterogeneous and less connected, and that's bad. And Wickham, who says about the same thing happens, but because he's focused, at least for part of his argument, on peasants, it's good. And in your discussion, you end basically at the beginning of the 5th century when you have some of these interesting trends where, as Scheidel says, people might be, or the economy might be shrinking, but people might be getting taller. And I'm wondering what actually you think does happen to this region after the 5th and 6th centuries. And do you think it was bad or good in all of the possible senses that can mean?
So the first question is, we don't really understand why we have this weird little uptick in the early 5th century. And the more we get chronological granularity, it's a weird moment. It doesn't correspond with anything that it ought to correspond with, right? Why the first half of the 5th century, right? And then it's gone. It doesn't even make it to the second half of the 5th century, right? So by the time, you know, you have your barbarian invasions, you can't find anybody in the landscape anyway. So what I think happens, and this is partially what Leslie talked about, it becomes this incredibly local world. It's true, right, that you can still find the odd amphora from Gaza, right? And so there are these connections that exist to an outside world. And, you know, they're in their own way, they're relatively robust. Nonetheless, the world that you have tends to be just really highly concentrated. And I think that if you imagine actual people living in this world, whereas before they managed their affairs on a huge palette, right? That palette has now shrunk, right? The places in which they do things, right? Their sphere of activity has become smaller. Is that a bad thing? Ooh, I don't know. We're all supposed to be into localism now, so I'm not allowed to say that it's a bad thing. It's certainly a very different thing.
Mr. Hunt.
Fascinating talk. I'm going to ask about something you didn't talk about, which is the role of forests.
So we have good data for forests. We don't have very many of them. What's interesting is that the number of the percentage of landmass that seems to be forested doesn't change, and it's more or less the same as today. So when I say it's a conservative landscape, I'm really serious about that. So we've run a whole series of models to try to test if we have forestation, deforestation. Nothing. It stays the same. In part, it's because there's not a whole lot of other ecological niches that forests would naturally occupy. The deforestation that takes place probably maybe even in the Bronze Age. It's certainly already well underway by the Etruscan period, which is true for lots of parts of Italy. And in fact, there's a lot of pollen data that suggests even in places near Rome that there aren't huge changes in forestation in moments that you would think they would have them, probably because they're very good at managing their forests. Now, what we have is this big sucker of wood, which is the ceramics factory, right? I mean, getting a kiln up to 900 degrees requires either a lot of wood or a lot of olive pressings or a lot of stuff. And we can see them importing wood that seems to be coming from the mountains in at least some quantities. We couldn't figure out why in the world you build a ceramics factory near no road, no obvious resource, no nothing, not even near any wood. It's near a river, but it's not navigable. So we still never figured out why they do this. It's agency, right? Someone bought that piece of land and decided that they would invest in ceramics manufacturing. They certainly didn't do it for the wood, right? Because they have to bring the wood in from Monte Amiata.
And there's a lot of cheap labor, perhaps?
Surplus of labor. Field drains equal child labor, right? There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of surplus labor.
You mentioned the economy becoming more local and also the issue of barter versus money. From the evidence that you have about coins, is there an evolution there? And also, what's the value of the smallest coin?
So the smallest coins we have are these late antique numi, right, which have values of, you know, something over a penny and less than 20. I mean, they're 25 cents. They're worth very little money. They are abundant, but this, I think, has as much to do with monetary supply as monetary access. So all late antique sites produce tons of these little numi. Okay, it's one of the features of late antique coinage. They seem to be massively supplied with them. It follows a moment of inflation, in which they're pumping out huge quantities of these things for low value and low value exchange. You can't buy very much with them, and so you actually do need rather a lot of them in order to do anything. So the spike that we have in actual coin finds also is a spike, an inflationary spike and a monetary supply spike, right? So they all go together. So I don't think that the purchasing power of these 5th century peasants is any greater than their 1st century predecessors, right? Because the coins that they have simply can't buy as much. So what could you buy with them? You could buy a pot. You can't buy an animal.
Is that more from the 2nd century?
No, these are these tiny value 5th century coins. They're paper thin bronze coins.
There's lots of questions I know in the audience, but there's also lots of drinks and refreshments there. I propose that we continue the questions and conversation with a glass in hand after a little bit of applause for our
Thank you both.